Joining me now from Le Coteuil in northern France is Patricia Chagnon, who is the regional councillor of the National Front Party. In Paris, we have journalist Elisabeth Moutet, a columnist for the UK's Telegraph newspaper group, The Weekly Standard and The Sun. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Patricia Chagnon, let's start with you. What do you make of the President's plans to reform? It's not only building new prisons, isn't it? He actually wants to, it seems, reform the penal system itself somewhat.
Well, our incarceration system has suffered for many years from severe neglect and lack of funding. And French prisons are horribly understaffed and terribly overcrowded. Macron wants sentences under 6 months to be applied outside prisons, and he wants judges to, he will ask judges to apply more alternative sentences and use electronic bracelets and other gadgets. It is quite scandalous to try to say to the French people today that we should be looking at using electronic bracelets. Let me just remind everybody that the terrorist, the Islamic terrorist who killed a Catholic priest near Rouen in July 2016 was actually one of those prisoners with an electronic bracelet who was not serving a sentence but outside a prison with an electronic bracelet, just free to go where he wanted. And he actually walked into the church and assassinated the priest while he was holding mass. So it did not protect society, and it will not protect society from terrorists who need to be locked up. The incarceration system is there to lock up dangerous criminals, of course, and to keep them away from society, but also to dissuade them from reoffending and sending a clear message to those who might consider breaking the law, and to tell them very clearly that breaking the law is not a good idea.
Yes, but so can I? We've got to come back to that point about that terrorist. Surely Emmanuel Macron is not talking about suspects or criminals like that. He's talking about people who have sentences of less than 1 month, which he says are ineffective because they have no follow-up and check-up procedure on those people who are sentenced to that shorter sentence. And he's talking about lesser crimes. He's talking about people taking drugs. He's talking about minor driving infractions. He wants fewer people in the jails, which you say is a good thing. He's not talking about potential terrorists, surely.
I'm definitely not saying that fewer people in jails are a good thing. I'm saying that we need to have, we agree on the fact that there is not enough room in French prisons today to cope with the number of prisoners, and that our prisons are overcrowded and overstaffed. We feel very strongly that every crime needs to be punished, and we would like to see a zero-tolerance policy being applied. Mr. Macron, in addition to what he said about prisons, has also stated that he wishes to re-establish certain civic rights for prisoners, like voting. Well, to resume this really is basically saying Mr. Macron is sending the wrong message to those people who are thinking of breaking the law. Minor offences will be forgiven. Offenders and criminals will take this into consideration and will see it as weaknesses. A sentence, especially a prison sentence, however short, is being deprived of your freedom and is a very, very strong deterrent. This will no longer be the case with Mr. Macron's reforms, and as a consequence, it will weaken the state. Macron, I think, also has contempt for the victims, shows contempt for the victims. Victims must be able to trust the state, that the state will punish the offenders of crimes and offences that have been committed in society.
Okay,
and they have
Patricia.
They have right to see people being punished.
OK, we have another guest, so let's get another take on this. Elisabeth Moutet, you wouldn't expect the National Front to agree with the Macron policy, I suppose, but everybody agrees that French prisons are overcrowded. What are the other defects? What's lacking in Macron's plans for prison reform?
Oh, there are many things that you could, many angles at which you could look at that, but basically what is lacking is money. Because there have been for a long time plans to build more prisons and more modern prisons. And when Nicolas Sarkozy came in, he had a junior minister in charge of building more prisons. And that, of course, vanished with the financial crisis of 2008, and it never came back. Monsieur Macron has said in his platform when he ran for president that he wanted 15,000 new prison places to be made ready, and he's now said this is unrealistic and we can only build 7,000. What he really means is they can't afford the kind of spending that would create new prisons and not just add to prisons that exist. And there's a large element of NIMBYism in that people do not really want to have a prison in their neighborhood. It's that you have to buy the land. It's all expensive and difficult. And the state in which French prisons are just now is horrendous. You've got people who are packed 6 or 8 in a tiny cell. They only are allowed to take a shower once a week. They see cockroaches on the floor. Some of them actually sleep on thin mattresses on the floor. And I'm all for prison sentences, but I don't think we've condemned people to live like animals. So that's a real problem. You then have the problem of radicalisation in prison. He has promised that radical inmates would be isolated. This is something that the prison guards are more and more keen on, and it's perfectly understandable. They do not want to reform a revolt against them. The situation in itself is a tinderbox, and I think Monsieur Macron is well-meaning, and he sort of managed to sort of give hints to everyone that he was listening to them. But mostly, I think this is underfunded, so it will be a small reform. I don't think it's going to change many things. We know perfectly well that many of those sentences that have been given by judges are never enforced because there simply is no space.
Okay, so we've identified some of the problems. Let's look at some potential solutions, because Macron has said, and I don't want to, having already done it once, put words into Patricia's mouth, but Patricia did say that every crime should be punished, and Macron may have addressed that particular issue there. He says prison sentences are not there to respond to society's emotions. He says that a convicted individual is meant to return to society. And the rate of recidivism of people recommitting a crime after being released from prison and then going back into jail is 60% in France. And he wants to specifically tackle that. He wants to put more money into rehabilitation programs. Again, that's got to be a good thing. Elisabeth, first to you.
Again, the problem is that one of the ways to avoid recidivism, which I think we all want in terms of sort of healing the fabric of society, and one of the ways to do this is to have proper follow-up afterwards. And then again, we're talking about more people on the ground. We're talking about people who've got more time to oversee the people who recently liberated. This country is unable to offer proper vocational training to normal people who have committed no crimes. And there again, you've got a problem in that there ought to be something already organized within the prisons for people to either learn a job or at least get some skills in terms of job hunting. And then there has to be support afterwards. And again, I think, I do not condemn the people who work on this, because I've met people who work in prisons and they are dedicated and they work hard. I think there's a question of possibly reorganizing this so that it's not so much top-down with the ministry at the top. Top-down is a very old French system, and it dates back to the Sun King, and we like top-down hierarchical structures, but we need to have something that will enable initiatives overseen but not entirely organized from the top, and that would help the prisoners find openings in a society that still has structural employment of almost 10%.
Okay, Patricia, what solutions would you like to see implemented, apart from more money being made available?
Well, definitely money is a key issue, and it's where the priorities have to be clearly established. I think for the overcrowding of the prisons, we all agree that the conditions are horrendous and unacceptable for the prison, not only for the prisoners, but also for the prison staff. So, yes, we need to build more prisons, and the 15,000 that Macron promised at the beginning when he was on campaign and has been reduced to 7,000 is totally unacceptable. But we also need to look at other solutions. We need to look at solutions of maybe reconverting empty public buildings into a low-security facilities for people who have committed minor crimes and who are convicted of have very minor convictions. We also need to be looking at signing agreements with countries of origin of certain prisoners who are not French, and to see how we can bring them back and do their imprisonment in their home countries rather than in prisons in France. Apart from the overcrowding, I was addressing the problem of the conditions in the prison, and your other guest also spoke about it. Over the past couple of years, the jobs have become just hell for the people working in those prisons. The prisons are understaffed. The people are overstretched, and they are totally exhausted. But there is something else. They are suffering from verbal abuse, from physical abuse, and they are constrained by many procedures and lots of red tape in trying to get control over their prisoners within the prisons. And that also, the authority of the staff in the French prisons need to be restored. They need to be more of them, but they also need to have the adequate authority to be able to do their jobs correctly. It is totally unacceptable that they can be insulted and that nothing is done about it.
Okay,
So,
listen, we only have about 2 minutes left, so I want to just give you 1 minute each, okay, to end with, and don't go over it because we won't cover it. What about the Scandinavian systems? In all those countries, in Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, the recidivism rate is roughly around 40%. There are open prisons. They look like youth hostels. Some of the prisoners can go into towns and do their jobs. They can see their families at weekends. That system seems to work. Would it work in France, or is it very specific to Scandinavia? And Elisabeth first, 45 seconds.
I would like for the Scandinavian system to work in France, and I'm not sure it would, because Scandinavia is a very cohesive society with a great deal of solidarity inbuilt and a very flat hierarchy of relationship in society. And that probably comes from being a place where the winters are harsh, and if you cannot count on your neighbours and people in society, you can very well die of just exposure. And I think there's a great deal in terms of the social contract that wouldn't work in France, but you could try it as an experiment, and it would be a very good thing, as you said, on sort of low-level criminals. It would be a start, and it would be easier to build from a small start and then try and spread it.
Really appreciate the brevity. Patricia, can you be just as brief, please?
I shall try. Yes, well, we have tried under François Hollande. Mrs. Taubira, his Minister of Justice, tried the alternative punishments and alternative ways to deal with crimes, and it did just simply not work in French society. So I think the past has proven that we need to change the method, and what Macron is doing is basically an extension of what Mrs. Taubira had started. So we have recently seen the problems in the prisons, but they are an extension of the problems that have been in French society all over with our police forces, but also with our medical forces and our firefighters. It is time that the authority is reinstored and that people, both people who think that they can commit crimes, but also victims, get confidence in the state that they will actually take care of the business.
Patricia Chagnon and Elisabeth Moutet, thank you very much indeed.